everybody. Welcome to our presentation tonight. It is called Wizards and Magicians Were Found Everywhere. Legends of Witchcraft from the Nordic countries. And what is a witch? What do witches do? This presentation will start to address these deceptively simple questions in a Nordic context. It'll look particularly at the witch of Nordic legends, and we'll talk about the difference between legends and how they differ from folk tales. Our speaker tonight is Amber Rose Cederström. She's a Ph.D. candidate in Scandinavian Studies on the Folklore track, and her research focuses on Nordic legends of witchcraft, and she's writing her dissertation on verbal and visual legends of witchcraft as expressed in the 17th century. The Witchcraft Trials of Finmark, which is in northern Norway, and murals of the milk-stealing witch, dating from about 1500. And I think she also has a book coming out in 2020. Maybe, she could tell us more about that. It's called Men and Milk Witches on Gotland, a folkloristic perspective on an art historical motif. So, Amber.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to make sure, so we've got, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 folks so far. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm
right.
A few more right now.
Okay, great. So just a couple of corrections. I actually recently earned my PhD, so I am done with the dissertation. Thank God. So thank you. And I don't actually have a book coming out, which is actually also thank God. Thank you, Jane, for that in the chat there. But I do have an article coming out, and actually a couple of articles and book chapters coming out, which I think is what you were referring to. Okay, so okay. Thank you for that. So let me just dive right in here and see if I can share the screen.
Oh, I should say, people, if you have questions for Amber, just please put them in the chat and we'll take care of those.
All right, does everyone see the PowerPoint there, I hope? Not, or okay, great. Okay. So since this presentation is about legends, I thought I'd kind of open just by reciting one, telling one. This is something, a variant of a legend that's known throughout Scandinavia and actually well beyond it as well. So when our house burned down, we stayed with a woman in northern Ölgod. She told us about another woman in her neighborhood who could milk other people's cows with a knife. Sometimes she took so much milk that some of the cows at the mill would not give any milk at all. The same woman had a little girl. When she went to school, she always took some bread and cheese with her. The other children said to her, "How do you get cheese like that? You don't have any milk to make cheese." "Oh, yes, we do," said the girl. "My great-grandmother sticks a knife into a beam and puts a pot underneath and milks into it." I'm a folklorist, meaning I study the informal pieces of culture that inform identity. Hopefully, some of you saw my husband's presentation last week, and I know he spent some time talking about what folklore is as well, so I'm not going to linger on it too much here. But one thing that I like to tell my students is that folklore is how we know how to be who we are. What I mean by that is that all kinds of folklore, the jokes and stories that we tell, the foods that we eat, the things that we wear, the things that we do at holidays and celebrations. All of it tells us who we are and how to be who we are, in distinction from other groups of people, whether large groups or small. Legends are just one kind of oral folklore. They're believed to be true, unlike fairy tales. They're set in the real world and in the current day, unlike myths, for instance. And they often feature specific people in real places. So if you remember the legend that I just read to you about milking with a knife, we've got a friend of a friend type, right? the storyteller says, we stayed with a woman who told us about another woman. So there's just a little bit of separation, but there's still a link to someone true, someone real, someone believable. Throughout that legend, there's a tone of belief, and it features ordinary people, normal folk. It's set in the recent past, recent history. There are specific places, specific people who are named. So that's basically what a legend is. But what is a witch? There's actually no single definition of this term, even in just Scandinavia itself. There are different stereotypes, different perceptions. And even within the Nordic region, there are a few different stereotypes that we can talk about. So there's the one that we're maybe even the most familiar with, the idea of a specifically female person who is envious and is in some way or to some degree connected with the devil or with Satan. There's another perception, another stereotype of a specifically male sorcerer who tends to be associated with the Sami, or is described as Finnish, right, who is other than. And finally, there's the idea of a learned ecclesiastic, someone who uses the Black Book or grimoires. And you'll find this especially in Iceland, but also elsewhere in the Nordic region as well. Today, I'm just going to focus on the first of these stereotypes. Again, probably the one that we're most familiar with, and the one that's most common throughout Europe, legendary generally, the female witch. Historically, women who were accused of witchcraft tended to live in the neighborhood. They were neither the poorest nor the richest of people. And while they tended to be older, witches could be of any age. They could even be children. So what did they do? And this is again Scandinavia specific, but often you'll find a lot of these things kind of throughout Europe as well. And they did a lot of things. They could control the weather. They could affect the outcomes of certain activities like fishing or hunting. They could affect sex and reproduction. So they could make people fall in love or fall out of love. They could interfere with someone's ability to have a child. Of course, they could fly. Witches had a tendency to kidnap and or kill children. They might worship the devil. They were thieves, as in Scandinavia and Northern Europe generally, especially they stole dairy, as we saw in the legend at the start of this, stealing milk. They could shapeshift into a variety of creatures. And of course, they could cause sickness, various kinds of misfortune, and they could kill. So basically, everyone up till the 20th century believed that witches were capable of all of these things. But for the most part, at least towards the beginning of the early modern period, when most witch trials happened, neighbors, the sort of folk, were more concerned with the economic and personal consequences of witchcraft than with grand theology. But the elites of Europe, including much of Scandinavia, were very concerned, not so much with neighborly disputes over a dead cow or whatever, but rather with where the power to kill cows magically came from, namely in the theology of the time, the devil. So elites were really concerned with this one specific thing that witches were supposed to be able to do, or that they were supposed to do frequently, which is worship the devil. And the reason that they were so concerned about it was because worshiping the devil wasn't just a bad personal decision. It meant that you had become a member of a conspiracy that was aimed at state and local governments and even Christendom itself. You were a member essentially of a kind of terrorist organization. And this is why in the early modern period, believers in diabolical witchcraft drove witch hunts that spiraled sometimes massively out of control, terrified officials, And we should remember that a lot of them truly were terrified. They weren't looking for one witch who did one thing, but they were looking to uproot the entire sleeper cell of witches in their communities. Whatever might have started the trial, a stillborn child or a surprising storm that ruined crops, that was no longer the center of the investigation. Rather, the aim was to force convicted witches to name their accomplices. However, and I want to emphasize this point, by far, the most witchcraft trials in Scandinavia and in Europe generally were small-scale affairs between neighbors and only rarely ended in death sentences. More common punishments were fines, public confessions, and in more extreme cases, exile. And at issue were the types of maleficia, the malevolent magic, in the list that we've already seen. Things like affecting the amount of milk someone's cow produced, or perhaps causing a shipwreck. In witchcraft trials, we see legends of witchcraft employed as interpretive tools. Something bad happened to you. Why? The legends that you've heard your whole life, maybe legends that you've even told yourself, can explain why. However, there were a few dramatic instances in which folk beliefs and elite concerns collided in Scandinavia with horrific consequences. The largest witchcraft trial in Scandinavia took place in Sweden between 1668 and 1676. In brief, belief that witches were kidnapping children and taking them to worship the devil at a place called Blocola sparked panics that spread from Mora, a parish in the central province of Dalarna, all the way to Stockholm. These trials were marked by eyewitness testimony of the children themselves, who reported fantastical and often horrific events at Blocola. Parental panic forced local authorities to take the matter seriously, and eventually a series of specially appointed government commissions raced to respond to the spreading rumors. Numbers are uncertain, but no fewer than 300 people, mostly women, were executed before the trials ended. The Blocola Trials involved a lot of oral folklore about witches. First, of course, the witch's interest in children, which in its broad outlines is common to most witchcraft beliefs across Europe. Second, the witch's ability to fly. In Sweden, witches could make just about anything fly by rubbing it with a special ointment they got from the devil. And this was made, according to children's testimony during the trials, by boiling the demonic offspring that witches had by intercourse with the devil and his demons. Nor did witches just fly on broomsticks. Instead, they used a variety of farm implements, as well as living creatures, especially cows, which in the normal course of things, we should remember, do not carry people on their backs and don't fly for the matter either. Sometimes they also rode horses in the same manner. And they would also even use men whom they rode like horses. So if you woke up exhausted after a night of supposed sleep, it could mean that you had been ridden by a witch all night. Similarly, if an animal seemed exhausted and weak, it might have been stolen and ridden by witches. According to later legends, you could make witches fall out of the sky by shouting their names or ringing church bells or just shooting at them. And if you were clever, you might also be able to turn the tables on the witch and use her own enchanted bridle on her, thus riding her home from Blocola and revealing her identity to her unsuspecting husband, who is often, again, according to the later legends, the local minister. Thirdly, the place Blocola itself has a long history in the oral tradition in Sweden. And it's an interesting example of how elite and folk beliefs could intertwine and support and affect one another. The idea of witches gathering in large numbers to worship the devil, celebrate in obscene ways, and perform magical rites was a feature of diabolical witchcraft across the continent of Europe. And it was also a major feature of elite concerns. Remember that obsession with worshiping the devil. Often these gatherings were said to happen on mountaintops, and which mountain it was varied by region. So the word Blocola is significant because it means blue hill. And witches and other malevolent supernatural creatures had been associated with the color blue, really more like a blue-black, since the Viking Age at least. Blocola has been identified with a real place, the island of Blå-Jungfrun, located in the Kalmar Strait between Öland and the mainland, at least since 1555, when the exiled Swedish Archbishop Olaus Magnus wrote in his description of the northern peoples about it. He writes there, "Moreover, a tall mountain rises near the northern coast of the island, which the common sailors, in order to shun an unlucky omen and storms at sea, call the Virgin. It is said that at certain times of the year, a coven of northern witches assembles on this mountain to try out their spells." Olaus himself seems kind of skeptical in writing about this, but the association clearly was nothing that he made up. It was something that was common to the oral tradition at the time. And the association has stuck ever since. And you can see, by the way, why witches would need to fly to get there and back in the course of a single night. Jungfrun, which I've noted on the map in the lower right there with the lower circle, it's quite a long ways from Mora, where the witch trials started. So here we've got what seems to be a folk belief in the oral traditions, perhaps specifically an oral tradition of sailors, that eventually blended with elite, essentially continental beliefs about what witches did and why. And this was reinterpreted in the different context of folk beliefs in Dalarna that centered on the danger to children. And although few people in Sweden today still believe in devilish rites occurring on Blocola, which today is a national park, the tradition has changed again, but it's still active. Today, Swedish children dress up as witches at Easter time, especially Maundy Thursday, and this is when witches traditionally were most active in Sweden, and either hand out greeting cards and candy or receive candy, not unlike American Halloween. This is a good example of how folklore shifts, and yet at the same time is still sort of conservative. Witches aren't believable legends here, but rather visible dressing up kids. We're not talking about oral folklore anymore, but rather customary folklore, something that you do. Still, our small witches here are interested in food and in visiting neighbors' homes, and they come out at Easter time, just as they always have. This also, incidentally, is a good example of folklore as knowing how to be who you are. If you're a Swede, you probably went around at Easter dressed as a witch when you were young. It was just something you did. In much the same way that if you're an American, chances are you dressed up and went around to neighbors' houses at Halloween when you were a kid. Despite his skepticism about Blocola, Olaus Magnus, like many educated men of his day, believed that the farther north you went, the more witches and wizards there were. This was partly because the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia and Finland, the Sami, had not yet converted to Christianity, and the Baltic states had converted only lately and uncertainly. Bigotry towards non-Christians and non-Scandinavian speaking peoples was interpreted in terms of witchcraft, which had developed firstly along perceptions of heresy in elite circles. In folk belief, meanwhile, the cardinal direction of north was associated with Satan, and had been for some time, to the point where medieval churches often had no windows on the north side, and no one save for criminals and suicides was to be buried on the north side of the church in Scandinavia. So it's perhaps not much of a surprise that we find one of the worst periods of witch trials in Nordic history to have taken place in the far north of Norway, in the province of Finnmark, Norway's northernmost, easternmost, and least populous region, even today. Several panics took place here over the course of the 17th century, resulting in 91 people being killed for the crime of witchcraft. This number accounts for nearly a third of all of Norway's witchcraft executions, even though the province held less than 1% of the country's population. And most of those killed, roughly 80%, were women. So what did the witches of Finmark do? Well, they were accused of many of the same things as witches were elsewhere in Scandinavia, but especially for bad storms and shipwrecks, low fishing hauls, which were prevalent throughout the 17th century and devastated the local economy. They were also accused of conspiracies against the local regional governor and of convening in sabbats or parties with the devil. They were also accused of keeping demonic imps called apostles. And if you've heard of witches' familiars, it's basically the same idea here, little demons or imps who would help you carry out your evil spells. Finmark witches were also known to shapeshift, especially into bird shapes or cats, in order to move around freely and cast spells. So once again, we see a mix of elite concerns and local folk beliefs in the Finnmark witch trials. And one reason that I find trials so fascinating in particular is precisely because we can see almost in real time how different groups of people rely on legendary narratives to construct events that both groups of people find acceptable, find believable, and how different concerns that emerge from these legends interact from each other. So we see, for instance, the witches develop a tradition in Finnmark of how they learned magic in response to elite questions about it. And over time, the narrative became quite stable. One after another, the women would confess that another, usually already accused and sometimes already executed witch, had literally fed witchcraft to her, unbeknownst to the fledgling witch. So witchcraft was conceived as something edible, something that you ate or drank. And basically the women were trying to claim that they had been poisoned, that they hadn't chosen to become witches, but were inducted into the society against their will. And this is not typically part of Norwegian witchcraft lore, or at least I've yet to encounter it anywhere else. But during the 17th century, it certainly seems to have become part of the oral tradition among the accused, and that prompted authorities to take it seriously and believe it. After all, if multiple women across many years independently confess to the same thing, how could it not be true? It used to be the case that folklore was conceived of as fossilized knowledge from the past, threatened by modernization and enlightened belief about things like, among other things, witchcraft. That's no longer how folklore is understood by scholars. Instead, we know it to be dynamic, emergent, retaining ancient features perhaps, but always responsive to specific contexts and community needs. Unfortunately, that means that, like other cultural constructions, folklore can be employed for some pretty horrific things. In the case of witchcraft, the early modern period witnessed a relative explosion of witchcraft trials, sometimes with the harshest of outcomes. In the Finnmark trials, record after record ends with this chilling phrase, "Dømt til ild og bål," which basically means sentenced to fire at the stake. And one of the lessons that I think it's important to take from episodes like this from the past is that folklore is alive, but it can also be deadly. And that's unfortunately as true today as it was then. So I know that that's kind of a downer to end on. So I would also like to say that I find witches endlessly fascinating and hope that I've managed to spark some interest and some questions for you all as well. And I also just had to share a picture of my own fuzzy familiars, our cats, Titus and Toddle. So I hope that there are questions. I also have a couple more things to say about sort of magic generally, if that's something that folks are interested in. And I can talk more about the trials or the legends as well, if that's something that folks are interested in. But I am going to go ahead and actually stop sharing my screen. Actually, maybe I won't because I can pull up the chat anyway. So yeah, so I'd like to invite any questions from folks. And you can just paste them in the chat. Here we go. One from Jane. How do you think the dark Nordic nights contribute to the folklore of witches? It's a really good question. I hesitate to ascribe too much to it, just because legends of witchcraft exist basically everywhere. And in a lot of ways, we're the weird ones for not believing in witches or in magic generally. But I will say that especially the Finmark trials, I think the nighttime actually played a kind of large role. And I haven't researched this precisely. But Finnmark, so as I said, it's the northernmost province in Norway. So it's dark for a lot of the year. It is a place where the sun sets in the fall and doesn't rise again until the spring. And yes, as Trisha says, it's way up there in the Arctic. Some of it is, in fact, above the Arctic Circle. And most of the executions and the trials happened in the winter. And I don't think that that's a coincidence exactly. I think that the simple stress of not seeing the sun for that long probably played some role. In some ways, I think it probably exacerbated the the torture that these women were experiencing, and men, I should say, as well. I mean, they literally didn't see light for months, and the accused were not only like everyone else, kind of in the darkness that whole time, but they, of course, were imprisoned as well in what's called, I think, the witch's hole, which you can imagine how unpleasant that was. And in Finnmark and in other places as well, they were subjected sometimes to what's called the Water Ordeal. And this was a way to find out if someone was a witch or not. And the idea was that since water was holy and made by God, if you sank into it, it meant that God accepted you and you weren't evil. Whereas if you floated, God had rejected you and you were evil. So in practice, this meant that if you were a witch and tied up and you sank, then you were innocent of being a witch, but you probably drowned. And if you floated, then you were a witch and you died that way. And of course, in Finnmark, these water ordeals were carried out in the sea, which again, northern Norway, it's never fun to jump into the Arctic Ocean, no matter what time of year it is. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that that in some cases, at least, I think the dark did exacerbate some of the trials. So there's another question here. If witches had magic and power, do people think they wouldn't have been caught or wouldn't have died from being burned? Another great question. So in later legends, you do kind of find solutions to this. So there's a legend actually from Sweden that I'm thinking of in particular. So a lot of milk stealing witches, and we saw an example of one at the very top of this. A lot of milk stealing witches used a kind of familiar to go and steal milk on their behalf. And this was a creature, a little demonic imp that was shaped like a ball of wool, or like a cat, or like a hare that would go and suckle directly from your neighbor's cows and then bring it back to you and vomit it into your churn, and you could make butter from the stolen milk. And this was called by a variety of names, a troll cat or a milk hare or various other things. And in this particular legend, one witch who had been caught wouldn't burn. They had her at the stake and she just wouldn't burn, she wouldn't die. Until they caught her troll cat, her milk hare, and burned some of the stolen milk from this creature along with her, and then she burned. So it's something that does come up in the legends, but in the trials itself, themselves, it's surprisingly absent. And I don't have a good reason for this. I think about this in terms of the shape-shifting, actually, right? So again, in Finmark, for instance, the women confess to turning into birds, into cats, and creatures that you would think might be able to escape fairly easily if they wanted to, but they don't. And sometimes this is because after their confession, the devil has abandoned them, they say, or because the presence of a minister or a priest prevents the devil from working his power, etc. So they did come up with some rationales for some of it, but it's surprisingly, it doesn't get the attention that you might expect it would. So another question, it seems like men were a lot less likely to be on trial. Were men accused of the same types of offenses as women? Great question. So first of all, I should say that in some parts of Europe, the gender balance was reversed. So actually in Finland and in Iceland, far more men than women were accused, convicted, and executed of witchcraft. So it does vary by region quite a lot. The offenses do differ somewhat, kind of generally speaking. Men, for instance, well, in some places in Europe are more likely to be accused of being werewolves than women, for instance. Men were less likely to be accused of love magic generally than women. Both genders, though, might be accused of things like worshiping the devil, for sure, and of milk theft, although that was primarily a women's crime. So they did differ. In Finmark, a lot of men, almost all of the men who were accused were Sami, and they were accused of slightly different things than the women were. So it depends a lot on where you're talking about. Both men and women were accused of essentially illicit healing, using the devil's power to heal cattle or to heal other people, which was also by the elites seen as an offense. So a couple questions about the U.S. witchcraft trials. So there are definitely correlations. In fact, there's a funny direct connection between the major Swedish Blocola trials and the famous trials in Salem, Massachusetts, which is that the American minister Cotton Mather, who was one of the sort of prime movers behind the Salem witchcraft trials, directly referenced the Swedish witchcraft trials as evidence that there is a sort of conspiracy, global conspiracy against Christendom. What's kind of horrible about that is that he did that after the Blocola trials had ended and had been completely discredited. But he either didn't get that news or didn't believe the discrediting of the trials. And these trials, some of them were going on at the same time as the trials in Salem. The major ones had mostly stopped by then, so that the American trials were a little later, but not by much. We're talking by, 5 years or 10 years or so. In general, trials kind of peaked in different places at different times. So, for instance, in Southern Europe, trials tended to peak much, much earlier, in the around 1500s, say. And kind of as you go farther and farther out from the core of Europe, trials peak later and later. And that's true of the Nordic region as well as the American trials, which, by the way, just did include more than just Salem. Those are, of course, the most famous ones. But there were other witchcraft trials and executions in the New World as well. here so I can see the chat a little better. Are there other questions? If not, maybe I'll actually go back to the PowerPoint just for a moment. I wasn't sure how much time I would have. But one thing that we can talk about is the idea of the magical worldview. And this is kind of something that informs witchcraft beliefs and belief in magic in general. So to us, or to a lot of Westerners, it kind of seems completely irrational and completely ridiculous to believe in magic, to believe in witchcraft, right? Why would anyone ever think that my cow dried up, therefore, my neighbor must be a witch, right? I mean, it just seems like a bizarre leap in some ways. And the answer is really to be found in this completely foreign to us worldview, which is anthropologists and folklorists and others refer to as the magical worldview. And the idea is basically that there's no such thing as coincidence, right? Nothing just happens. Things happen because something causes them. And sometimes this might be a deity, right? God makes things happen. But often it's because something else, someone makes them happen, right? And I don't know how many folks watched or remembered the X-Files, but this is essentially Special Agent Fox Mulder's worldview in many cases as well, right? That there are always reasons behind why things happen, and sometimes they are what we might think of or call supernatural in origin. And when you accept or when you kind of change your way of thinking about why things might happen, are they do things ever just happen, or is that ridiculous to imagine? Then you can start to understand why folks might believe in things like elves, right? Not just witches, but other creatures as well, who might affect things around the house, right? Why in the world do you do a load of laundry and you can't match up your socks afterwards? There's one sock that's always missing, right? It's not just a coincidence. Something happened to your missing sock. And of course, there are, with larger issues in your life, the the challenges get bigger and bigger, and the problems get bigger and bigger, and eventually you might start blaming things on folks that are truly serious, like the sudden death of your child, for instance. So that's just a little kind of background about how people could believe in magic and witchcraft. And I mean, I guess what I want to emphasize here is that it's not irrational. It's a different kind of rationality. It's a different approach to the world. And this is, I mean, it's not something that's, that we've stopped envisioning. Sometimes the anthropologists talk about the magical worldview versus a scientific worldview, and people no longer have a magical worldview. Now we're all enlightened and scientific and believe in coincidence. But that's really not very true of most people, I think, even those of us in the West who would like to think of ourselves as perfectly scientific, rational people. We still have moments, or at least I certainly have moments still, where things like a sock goes missing and it's like, how could that happen? Or if you've ever had an experience like you think of someone, an old friend whom you haven't thought of in a long, long time, and all of a sudden the phone rings and it's them, right? Those kinds of things that our minds might say, oh, it's what a weird coincidence. But some part of us might think, am I secretly telepathic, or something along those lines. And of course, there are little rituals that that all of us might do from time to time. Like if our favorite sports team is winning the World Series, and you know, we're like, oh my gosh, I haven't changed my socks for the last 2 days. I've been wearing the same pair of socks. I better keep wearing these exact same pair of socks throughout the entirety of the series. Or, you know, I'm not going to shave my beard until my team wins the Stanley Cup, right? All these kinds of little things that we do, I think can also sort of reasonably be described as part of the magical worldview. Oops. And I also want to highlight that in addition to kind of being more prevalent than we might think, a lot of witchcraft beliefs still come up in a variety of different ways. Some of them look quite traditional to our way of thinking. So this is actually an article from May 10th of this year from Norway. And what it says is belief in the pact with the devil. For 50 years, Inger Maria has lived with gossip about how she kastar djävlar, which I mean literally means throws devils at people. She took the blame for a stillborn child. So that's from this year. So we do still find elements of old-fashioned witchcraft beliefs even in quote unquote enlightened countries like Norway. So anyway, two elements to show the sort of longue durée, the length of some of these beliefs that underlie and that inform witchcraft beliefs. So are there other questions that I can approach? Now feel free to speak up if writing in the chat is. We have one from Jane. My family legend folklore includes my grandfather's grandmother's encounter with the devil in Norway before she immigrated to the US. So far as I know, she wasn't accused of witchcraft, but now it makes me even more curious about the story. Me too. So folklorists, when it's a personal experience narrative, when you have yourself an experience of meeting the devil, for instance, is often called a memorot, which is just a fancy sort of jargony word for a kind of legendary experience that you yourself have, and that now has become, as Jane says, a family legend, which is super cool. Interestingly, by the way, a lot of the sort of folk narratives about the devil throughout Europe, but also in Scandinavia, the devil's not really that terrifying often. He's almost laughable, and you can usually trick him or send him away with some fairly simple techniques, you know, or just saying Jesus Christ's name or something like that. So he's one of the weird things about European witchcraft and the period of the witchcraft trials. Excuse me. So I said that basically everyone everywhere has some kind of belief in witchcraft and magic, and that's true. But what makes the European witch trials so unique and stand out so much is that this folk belief, this magical worldview, became overlaid with this elite conviction that the devil was really powerful, really terrifying, and out to get you, and not just individuals, but out to overthrow governments, out to destroy the church, whichever church you worshipped at, namely Catholic or Protestant, right? And that image of the devil as this like incredibly overwhelming figure of horror never quite percolated through to folk belief. So instead, you've got devils who are, as I said, almost dismissed fairly simply in the legendary of Europe. Any other questions or comments? I'll stop sharing again.
Thank you so much, Amber.
You're welcome.
Really,
Thank you.
this is really fascinating. There's so much I didn't know, and glad to know it now.
Thank you.